My name is Mallory Reed, 24 years old, and I just graduated top of my class in financial analysis from Columbia University. I thought today was the beginning of my legacy, but it turned out to be the day my life was auctioned off. I stood in the middle of a magnificent Manhattan penthouse, my hand still gripping the honors degree I had worked so hard for. But the joy was strangled before it could even take shape by a bone-chilling coldness. My mother took a sip of expensive wine, her eyes scanning me like an expired piece of merchandise. "You're just a stray, and you're useless now. There's no reason for us to keep playing house." Instantly, a legal disownment paper was slammed onto the marble tabletop. My father smirked, forcing me to sign on the spot, claiming I no longer held any utility for my grandfather's trust fund. Instead of breaking down or crying, I looked him straight in the eye and let out a smile that froze the air in the room. I whispered, "Are you sure you want to kick me out today? Because I just discovered a few very interesting things about this so-called family." My confidence left them momentarily unsettled, but they had no idea that the first pawn in my takedown plan had just been placed. Why would a girl who just graduated be disowned by her own parents on her night of glory? What dark secrets are hidden behind the prestige of the Reed family? Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss my shocking countermove. The transition from that glittering penthouse to the mahogany-lined office of the family's estate lawyer 6 months earlier felt like walking into a meticulously planned trap. Clarence Reed sat across from me, his fingers steepled with a predatory patience that I had once mistaken for fatherly wisdom. Beside him, Genevieve Reed adjusted her pearls, her face a mask of practiced sorrow that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. We were there for the preliminary reading of my grandfather's will, a moment that should have secured my future, but instead became the catalyst for my destruction. Without a word of greeting, Clarence slammed a thick leather folder onto the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. "We found it, Mallory," he said, his voice dripping with a faux disappointment that made my skin crawl. He spread out a series of financial statements, each one flagged with bright red markers highlighting massive, unauthorized transfers from the family's core investment accounts. Over $2 million vanished into thin air. Every single document bore my digital signature, a perfect, untraceable replica of my own hand. I stared at the papers, the ink blurring as the realization hit me. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a professional execution. Clarence had fabricated a trail of embezzlement to frame me an ironclad excuse to strip me of my inheritance rights before the trust fund could even be unlocked. He needed that money to plug the bleeding holes in Reed Ventures, a firm that was secretly drowning in debt despite its prestigious facade. By turning me into a criminal in the eyes of the law, he could invoke the moral turpitude clause in the will, effectively erasing me from the succession line. I looked toward the man at the head of the table, the longtime family attorney, Mr. Arthur Sterling. He was the only person my grandfather truly trusted, yet he sat there like a statue, his eyes fixed on the silver pen in his hand. The silence from him was deafening, a betrayal that hurt worse than Clarence's lies. When Clarence leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive cigars and malice, he whispered the ultimatum. "Sign the voluntary forfeiture or I call the district attorney. You'll be in a jumpsuit before dinner." My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird seeking an exit. Just then, Arthur Sterling finally looked up, his gaze catching mine with a peculiar, sharp intensity. As he slid the forfeiture papers toward me, his voice was a low, gravelly monotone. "If you sign this document, the matter will rest here for now." There was a microsecond of silence where his eyes lingered on mine, a hidden spark of something that wasn't betrayal, but a silent command to endure. I understood then. I was outgunned and outmaneuvered. With a shaking hand, I gripped the pen and signed away my birthright, accepting the exile to a crumbling, decrepit cottage on the outskirts of the city, the only property Clarence couldn't touch, because it was held in a separate private deed. I walked out of that office a pariah, stripped of my name and my wealth, but carrying a seed of suspicion that was beginning to take root. The dust in the small cottage on the fringes of Westchester County felt thick with years of abandonment, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of the life I had just left behind. It was a crumbling sanctuary of peeling wallpaper and creaking floorboards, the only piece of ground I still owned. As I hauled my last suitcase into the dimly lit study, a shadow moved across the porch. A man with silver hair and a posture that still commanded respect despite his age stepped into the light. This was Gideon Thorne, the former head butler who had served my grandfather for 4 decades before being abruptly dismissed by Clarence years ago. He had been watching me from the tree line, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and urgency that made me drop my bags immediately. "Your grandfather knew this day would come, Mallory." Gideon whispered, his voice steady like an old oak. He didn't offer a hollow greeting. Instead, he pointed a trembling finger toward the massive built-in bookshelf that dominated the back wall. "He told me once, 'Gideon, if I am no longer here to protect her, tell her to check the stone behind the oak shelves.'" My heart skipped a beat as I approached the heavy woodwork. With Gideon's help, we cleared the dusty encyclopedias until a small recessed lever became visible. A heavy click resonated through the quiet room, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a steel-lined safe hidden within the masonry. Inside, tucked away from Clarence's reach, lay the dark reality of my existence. I pulled out a weathered envelope containing a fraudulent adoption agreement and several carbon copies of check stubs showing massive payouts to a disgraced doctor named Miller. The notes were clear. These were bribes paid 25 years ago to issue a death certificate for a newborn baby girl from the Thorne family, a child who had never actually died. My hands shook as I reached for the final document, a private DNA report commissioned by my grandfather months before his passing. The results were undeniable. I shared 0 genetic markers with the Reed lineage. I was the child they had stolen to secure a legacy that was never meant for them. The heavy silence of the discovery was shattered by the roar of a high-performance engine outside. A silver sports car screeched to a halt in the overgrown driveway, and Tristan Reed stepped out, his designer suit looking absurd against the backdrop of the decaying cottage. He didn't bother knocking. He kicked the door open with a sneer of entitlement. "I see you're settling into your new trash heap," he barked, tossing a thick envelope of cash onto the floor. "Consider this a mercy. Sign this house over to me for $50,000 and disappear. My father wants this place leveled by Monday morning, and I'm not leaving until the deed is signed." He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on the open bookshelf with a sudden predatory flash of suspicion. He knew something was here, and the threat in his voice told me he was willing to do much more than just buy the property to get it. The GPS led me away from the jagged glass towers of Manhattan and deep into the rural silence of a small town in Pennsylvania, where the air tasted of damp earth and wood smoke. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, the weight of the stolen files in my passenger seat feeling heavier with every mile. I pulled up to a small weathered farmhouse that looked as though it were being slowly reclaimed by the surrounding forest. This was the address Gideon had whispered to me, the home of the people whose lives had been shattered 25 years ago. As I stepped out of the car, a woman with tired eyes and hair the color of autumn leaves emerged from the porch. This was Lydia Thorne, and beside her stood a man whose face was a map of decades of hard labor and quiet grief. The initial encounter was agonizingly awkward. I was a stranger dressed in expensive fabrics standing on the threshold of their struggle. I didn't tell them who I was at first, only that I was investigating an old discrepancy in the Reed family archives. But as Lydia spoke about the tragedy at the hospital, how they were told their baby girl had died of a sudden respiratory failure, and how Clarence Reed's legal team had intimidated them into silence when they demanded an autopsy, the pieces of the puzzle began to bleed together. I saw my own reflection in the curve of her jaw and the way she held her breath when she was nervous. Despite the overwhelming physical similarities, the analytical side of my brain refused to surrender to emotion. I needed a cold, hard certainty that no amount of intuition could provide. That certainty arrived 3 days later through a secure encrypted link sent by Arthur Sterling. Under the cover of darkness, I had collected DNA samples from a discarded coffee cup Lydia had used and sent them to a private, independent laboratory that Sterling had vetted for total discretion. When the notification chimed on my phone, I held my breath, the blue light of the screen illuminating the cramped interior of my car. The result was a definitive, undeniable strike against the Reed's lies, 99.98% genetic probability. I wasn't just a stray or a legal convenience. I was the daughter of the people standing in that dilapidated house. The revelation hit me with the force of a tidal wave, but it wasn't just sadness that flooded my veins, it was a searing, white-hot fury. I looked back at the farmhouse, noticing the plastic sheeting covering broken window panes, and the way Lydia walked with a slight limp because they couldn't afford proper medical care. The Reeds hadn't just stolen me. They had systematically dismantled these people's lives to ensure they never had the resources to fight back. They lived in a world of gold and marble built on the foundation of the Thorne family's misery. My pain transitioned into a cold, calculated strength. I realized then that my education in high finance wasn't just for a career. It was the weapon I would use to burn the Reed Empire to the ground and reclaim the dignity they had stolen from my true bloodline. Returning to the heart of Manhattan felt like infiltrating an enemy fortress, but I traded my righteous fury for the perfect mask of a defeated daughter. I contacted Clarence Reed with a voice that trembled just enough to sound broken, pleading for a few hours at the penthouse to pack the sentimental belongings I had supposedly left behind. He granted the request with a smug, dismissive laugh, convinced that I was finally crawling back to him in shame. Little did he know, my designer handbags were now concealing sophisticated digital recording devices and specialized hardware designed to bypass the very security systems I once helped maintain. Stepping back onto that polished marble floor, I felt the oppressive weight of the Reed name, but this time I wasn't a victim. I was a ghost, haunting the halls of their deception. While Genevieve was busy at an auction and Clarence was sequestered in his study, I moved through the penthouse with surgical precision. I planted high-frequency microphones in the vents of the home office places, where the most sensitive conversations regarding Reed Ventures usually took place. My heart hammered as I accessed the home server, a direct line to Clarence's personal laptop. Within minutes, my software began cloning encrypted files that detailed a desperate, illegal siphoning of the trust fund's liquidity to cover the catastrophic losses of his failing firm. It was white-collar cannibalism at its finest, a paper trail of embezzlement that would make a federal prosecutor's career. Every click of the mouse felt like a nail being driven into the coffin of the Reed Empire. Later that evening, I met Arthur Sterling at a quiet, dimly lit library in Midtown, a place far removed from the prying eyes of the legal elite. The attorney's monotone demeanor from the office had vanished, replaced by a weary but resolute determination. He slid an old-fashioned USB drive across the table, his eyes darting toward the door. "I had to remain silent, Mallory." He whispered, his voice thick with a burden he had carried for years. "Your grandfather knew that if I handed you these keys before you were 24, Clarence would have seen it as a threat and eliminated you both legally and financially. He waited until you had the maturity to use this weapon effectively." The drive contained the final piece of the puzzle, a master key to an offshore encrypted cloud server. My grandfather had meticulously recorded years of Clarence's unethical dealings, but he had protected the data with a timed encryption that only unlocked upon my graduation and the specific legal triggering of the disownment clause. Sterling revealed that the moral turpitude trap Clarence had set for me was the very thing my grandfather had predicted. By attempting to ruin me, Clarence had inadvertently triggered the sequence for his own destruction. I realized then, that I wasn't just fighting for a lost inheritance. I was executing a master plan decades in the making. The silent girl who had signed those forfeiture papers 6 months ago was gone, replaced by a financial predator who was ready to reclaim everything. The crystal chandeliers of the Manhattan penthouse shimmered with a predatory brilliance as the city's elite gathered for what Clarence Reed intended to be his final triumph. I stood by the grand piano, the heavy silence of my resolve masked by the upbeat jazz playing in the background. Clarence stepped onto the small stage, his face flushed with the arrogance of a man who believed he had finally silenced his past. He raised a glass of vintage champagne, gesturing for the room's attention. "Today, we celebrate not just a graduation, but a transition," he announced, his voice booming with a false warmth that made my blood boil. "While some have proven themselves unworthy of the Reed name, I am proud to announce that my son Tristan Reed will officially take his place as the sole heir to our family's legacy and the trust fund that supports it." Tristan stepped forward with a smug, entitled grin, but before he could utter a single word, the jazz music died an abrupt, jarring death. A sharp digital feedback echoed through the high-end speakers, silencing the gasps of the crowd. Then a voice filled the room. It was Clarence's own voice, distorted but unmistakable, captured by the devices I had hidden weeks ago. "The girl is just a placeholder, Genevieve," the recording boomed. "I bought her from those pathetic Thornes for a few $100,000 and a fake death certificate. She was a legal tool to get my hands on the old man's billions, and now that the trust is unlocked, we're tossing her to the curb like the trash she is." The penthouse froze. Genevieve's glass shattered on the marble floor, her face turning a ghostly shade of gray as the elite of New York listened to the confession of a human trafficker. Clarence scrambled toward the sound system, shouting for someone to turn it off, but the recording transitioned into a detailed ledger of his embezzlement, narrated by the cold, analytical voice of my grandfather's digital files. Just as the final word of the confession finished, the heavy doors of the private elevator chimed. Two men in dark suits stepped out, flashing federal badges that gleamed under the lights. Behind them stood Arthur Sterling, no longer the silent observer, but a man of authority. "Clarence Reed," one of the agents announced, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You are under arrest for federal financial fraud, identity falsification, and the illegal procurement of a minor. FBI, don't move." The socialites who had just been toastying to Clarence's success retreated like a receding tide, leaving him and Tristan isolated in the center of the room. But the final blow wasn't delivered by the law. From behind the agents, a couple stepped into the golden light of the penthouse. Lydia and Gideon Thorne walked with a dignity that eclipsed every diamond in that room. As Lydia looked at Genevieve, the silence was absolute. I walked over to them, my true parents, and for the first time in 24 years I stood between the people I shared blood with. I looked at Clarence as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. "You told me I was useless now, Clarence," I whispered, my voice steady and cold. "But it turns out I was the only thing standing between you and a prison cell. And I've decided to move out of the way." The gavel fell with a finality that echoed through the marble halls of the New York Southern District Court, marking the definitive end of the Reed Empire. Clarence Reed was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, convicted on multiple counts of grand larceny, identity falsification, and the embezzlement of trust funds. His fall from grace was absolute, a public execution of a reputation built on sand and stolen lives. Genevieve Reed, stripped of her titles and the social prestige she had worshipped above all else, found herself an outcast in the very circles she once commanded. Without the stolen wealth to shield her, she vanished into the quiet ignominy of a life she had long looked down upon. I watched them being led away, not with a sense of triumph, but with the profound relief of a debt finally paid to the truth. I stood on the courthouse steps, the morning sun finally breaking through the Manhattan fog, and signed the final papers to reclaim my identity. I was no longer Mallory Reed, a placeholder in a criminal's desan. I was officially Mallory Thorne. Reclaiming my birthright wasn't about the money or the penthouse. It was about the blood in my veins and the parents who had never stopped grieving for the daughter they thought they had lost. The transition from the cold, calculated world of the Reeds to the genuine warmth of the Thorne family was the most significant journey of my life. I realized that the glittering facades of high society were often hollow, while the strength of a family bound by honesty and sacrifice was unbreakable. Justice, however, wasn't just about punishment, it was about restoration. With the legal guidance of Arthur Sterling I, I assumed control of the massive trust fund my grandfather had intended for me. I used a significant portion of those billions to ensure Lydia and Gideon Thorne would never have to worry about a broken window or a medical bill ever again. But the mission didn't stop there. I established the Thorne Justice Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing legal and financial support to families who have fallen victim to the abuse of power by the corporate elite. We focus on cases of guardianship fraud and illegal procurement, ensuring that no other family is dismantled by the greed of men like Clarence. My story serves as a stark reminder that the truth is a patient hunter. No matter how deep you bury a secret or how high you build your towers of deception, justice will always find its way to the light for those brave enough to seek it. I walked away from the courthouse that day, leaving the shadows of Manhattan behind, ready to build a future defined not by what I inherited, but by the integrity of the name I chose to keep.